I never thought the proudest day of my life would become the most humiliating evening I'd ever lived through. While they stood there laughing, convinced they'd finally put the old man in his place, I was already dialing the first of 37 phone calls that would bring down the most elaborate scheme any family in Calgary had ever orchestrated against one of their own. My name is Robert Hendricks. I'm 63 years old, and for 31 years I've run Hendricks Precision Engineering out of a building I bought on my own hands and back, just off McLeod Trail. We design components for oil and gas equipment across Alberta and Saskatchewan, and last fiscal year we cleared just over $14 million in revenue. I'm telling you this not to brag, but so you understand what kind of man my son's fiancée thought she was going to swindle out of $250,000 without consequences. The trouble started, as most troubles do in my life, with a woman I should have seen coming from a mile away. My wife Catherine left me when our son Nathan was 11 years old. She didn't leave for another man or for unhappiness or for any of the reasons you'd read about in a magazine. She left because she decided, somewhere around our 15th anniversary, that being married to a man who worked with his hands and came home smelling like machine oil wasn't the life she'd signed up for. She wanted Mount Royal parties and Banff ski weekends with people whose last names ended up on downtown buildings. I wasn't that man. I never pretended to be. She took Nathan with her when she moved to a condo in Mission. And for the next decade I watched my son turn from a freckled boy who loved fishing the Bow River into a polished young man who corrected my grammar at Thanksgiving dinner. Catherine remarried a commercial real estate developer named Gerald Whitmore when Nathan was 14. Gerald had 2 daughters from a previous marriage and a membership at the Ranchman's Club and a way of looking at me like I was something he'd stepped in on his way through the parking lot. I let it go. A father who picks fights with his son's stepfather loses the war before it starts. I paid for Nathan's private school. I paid for his undergraduate degree at McGill. I paid for his MBA at Rotman in Toronto. I paid for his condo in Kensington when he moved back to Calgary 2 years ago and told me he wanted to, in his words, reconnect with his roots. I was so happy I nearly wept at the dinner table. My boy was coming home. He brought her with him. Her name was Amanda Pierce, and she was 29 years old when Nathan introduced us at a restaurant on Stephen Avenue. She worked in what she called brand consulting, which as far as I could tell meant she had a laptop and opinions. She was beautiful. I'll give her that. Tall. Blonde. With the kind of smile that makes you want to pull out her chair and pay for her coffee. She called me Robert from the first handshake, and something in the back of my throat tightened. But I told myself I was being an old fool. A young woman calling her future father-in-law by his first name in 2024 wasn't a crime. It should have been the first warning. Nathan proposed to her 8 months after they started dating. He called me from her apartment and told me the news while she giggled in the background. I asked him if he was sure. 8 months isn't long enough to know a person's weather, let alone their climate. He laughed and said I was being the typical overprotective dad. He told me Amanda's parents had offered to help with the wedding, but they were modest people. A retired school teacher and a bookkeeper from Red Deer. And that he hoped I'd be willing to contribute as well. I told him I'd pay for the whole thing. I don't know why I said it. Maybe because Catherine had spent 15 years telling our son his father couldn't provide the life he deserved. Maybe because Gerald Whitmore would be sitting at the head table on her side. And I wanted my name on every flower, every plate, every linen. Maybe because somewhere deep down I knew I was buying a place at my own son's wedding. And I was too proud to admit it. I gave Nathan access to my secondary business account, the one I use for large capital expenditures. I told him to handle the payments directly with Amanda, to keep it simple, to send me summaries monthly so I could keep track. He hugged me when I handed him the debit card. He said, "Dad, you won't regret this." I regretted it within 90 days. Amanda chose a venue called the Fairmont Palliser downtown, which is where old Calgary money gets married. She chose a florist who imported peonies from Holland in June, when peonies grow in every backyard in the city. She chose a caterer whose menu read like a travel guide through France. She chose a wedding planner named Sylvia who charged $15,000 just to show up and nod at Amanda's decisions. By the time the invitations went out in early spring, I had already signed off on $180,000 in deposits and was assured that was only the beginning. I didn't question it. I should have, a smarter man, a less sentimental man, would have sat down with a spreadsheet and demanded an accounting. But my son was getting married, and I wanted him to remember that his father had given him the wedding of his dreams. I wanted Catherine to sit in the back row and see what I'd built. I wanted Gerald Whitmore to choke on his champagne when he saw my name on the programs. Pride. Gentlemen and ladies, pride is the slowest poison there is. The wedding was scheduled for the second Saturday in August. By late July, I had paid just over $240,000 into various vendors. I'd also started noticing small things. A charge to a boutique in Yorkville, Toronto, that Amanda had visited for her wedding dress, fitting, which would have been fine except the charge was $42,000, and Nathan had told me the dress was $19,000, a charge to a travel agency in Vancouver for what was labeled as the honeymoon. Except the honeymoon was supposed to be a gift from Catherine and Gerald. A charge of $11,000 to a jeweler on 4th Avenue, which I hadn't approved and which Nathan hadn't mentioned. I called my accountant, a steady man named Dwight Osmond who's been handling my books since 1998. I asked him to pull every transaction on the secondary account going back 6 months. He called me back 3 days later, and his voice had gone flat in the way. It only does when he's about to tell me something very bad. Robert, he said, we have a problem. Dwight had found $92,000 in charges that had nothing to do with the wedding. Luxury handbags from Holt Renfrew. A down payment on a 2024 Range Rover Velar registered to Amanda Pierce. A weekend at Chateau Lake Louise booked under her name alone. 2 months earlier, while Nathan had been in Toronto for a conference, jewelry, spa packages, 2 first-class flights to Cabo San Lucas in May, neither of which my son had taken. My hand, I'm not ashamed to say, shook when I held the phone. I told Dwight to keep digging and say nothing. Then I did something I hadn't done in 22 years. I drove over to Catherine's house in Mission. She opened the door in a cashmere sweater and a surprised expression. Gerald wasn't home. I asked her if I could come in. She hesitated long enough to make me wonder if she was going to say no, then stepped aside. I sat in her living room, which had a view of the river and artwork on the walls that cost more than my first house. And I told her what Dwight had found. I expected shock. I expected outrage on our son's behalf. I expected, at minimum, the same mother's protectiveness that had once made her stand in front of Nathan's bedroom door during a thunderstorm when he was 5 years old. Instead, she looked at her hands. Robert, she said quietly, there's something I need to tell you. Catherine had known about Amanda for over a year. Not just known about her, but helped steer Nathan toward her. Amanda was the daughter of a friend of Gerald's business partner, a young woman Catherine had described as driven and sophisticated. The introduction hadn't been accidental. The engagement hadn't been impulsive. And the wedding, my wedding, the one I was paying for with my life savings, had been engineered from the beginning to be as expensive as humanly possible, because Amanda Pierce wasn't marrying Nathan. She was marrying the Hendricks name, and more importantly, the Hendricks money. And she had been promised by Catherine that I would pay for everything without asking questions, because that was the kind of sentimental fool I was. I asked Catherine why. She looked out the window at the river. She said that Gerald's business had struggled over the last 2 years, that they'd borrowed against the house, that Nathan's trust fund, the one Gerald had managed since our divorce, had been quietly drained to cover losses, that Amanda had been told she could skim from the wedding budget to establish a private reserve for herself and Nathan, a kind of dowry in reverse, a safety net because nobody trusted Nathan to handle his own finances. My son didn't know, Catherine swore to me, with tears in her eyes. That Nathan didn't know? I believed her. I still do. My son is many things, some of them disappointing. But he isn't a thief. I drove home to my house in West Springs and sat in my study with a glass of Glenfiddich and thought for a long time I could have called Nathan that night. I could have confronted Amanda. I could have gone to the police. Which, in hindsight, is what I should have done. And I'll come back to that. Instead, I called Dwight back and I asked him one question. Can you document every unauthorized charge and have a full forensic accounting ready within 10 days? He said yes. 10 days later was the rehearsal dinner. I went to the rehearsal dinner. I smiled at Amanda's parents, who seemed like decent enough people and who, I suspected, had no idea what their daughter had become. I shook Gerald Whitmore's hand and felt his wedding ring press into my palm and thought about how much of his debt I was about to inherit if I didn't act. I kissed Catherine on the cheek and tasted her perfume and her guilt in equal measure. I told my son I loved him. I meant it. I went back to my hotel room at the Westin, because the wedding was downtown and I'd taken a room for the weekend, and I laid out my suit for the next day. Then I waited. The wedding was beautiful. I'll give Amanda that much. The Palliser ballroom was dressed in white peonies and ivory linens and gold-trimmed china, and the string quartet played Pachelbel as Amanda walked down the aisle in a dress that had cost me $42,000. Nathan sat at the altar in a tuxedo and looked at her the way I'd once looked at Catherine, and my heart cracked for him right there. Knowing what I knew, and what he didn't, the ceremony was lovely. The vows were heartfelt. Amanda cried at the appropriate moments. The reception was where she made her mistake. I was seated at the head table, next to Catherine, across from Gerald. Amanda's parents were at the other end. The speeches began after the salad course. Nathan's best man spoke. Amanda's maid of honor spoke. Gerald Whitmore stood up and made a speech about welcoming Amanda into the family. A speech so full of false warmth I could feel my jaw tightening. Then it was my turn. I stood up. I unfolded a piece of paper from my jacket pocket. I adjusted the microphone, and before I could say a word, Amanda stood up beside her new husband and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "Actually, Robert, I don't think we need a speech from you. This is a celebration. Not a lecture." The room went quiet. Nathan looked at her, confused. He started to say something. She put her hand on his arm. "I mean it," she said, smiling at me the way a cat smiles at a mouse. "It's already killed. This is my day. I don't want it ruined by someone who doesn't understand what it means to be family." Catherine stared at her plate. Gerald stared at his wineglass. 340 guests stared at me. I looked at my son. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I folded the piece of paper. I put it back in my pocket. I said, "Of course, Amanda, I wouldn't want to ruin your day." And I walked out of the Fairmont Palliser and into the summer night on 9th Avenue. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I didn't stop at the bar. I walked 4 blocks to my car, and I drove home to West Springs, and I sat in my study for exactly 11 minutes. Then I started making phone calls. It was 10:43 on a Saturday night. Most businesses in Calgary were closed, but weddings of that size are handled by people on call 24 hours a day, because rich people's emergencies don't wait for Monday morning. I had every vendor's direct line saved in my phone. I had Dwight's forensic accounting on my desktop. I had my lawyer, a woman named Marjorie Koenig, who I'd known since law school. On speed dial, I called the Fairmont Palliser first. I spoke to the banquet manager. I informed him that the final balance for the reception, which was due that evening, and which totaled $47,000, including the bar, would not be paid from the Hendricks account. I informed him that I had just sent a formal stop payment order through my bank's emergency line, and that if he wanted to pursue the balance, he was welcome to pursue it from the bride and groom directly. He said, "Sir, are you absolutely certain? The reception is still ongoing." I said, "I am aware." I called the florist and canceled the following morning's brunch arrangements, which were worth $9,000. I called the limo company and canceled the airport transfer to Cabo. I called the travel agency in Vancouver and canceled the honeymoon, a $26,000 trip to a resort in Los Cabos. I called the photographer and informed him that the final payment for the album and the $40,000 videography package would not be forthcoming. I called the band. I called the cake designer who was delivering a groom's cake brunch piece the next morning. I called the wedding planner, Sylvia, who owed me a trust account reconciliation that had been outstanding for 11 weeks. Every single one of them asked me the same question. Sir, are you sure? I was sure. Somewhere in the middle of these calls, around 11:30, my phone began to ring. Nathan. I didn't answer. He called 12 times in 40 minutes. I let them go to voicemail. Around midnight, Catherine called. I let that go too. At 12:47 in the morning, Amanda called. I let it ring twice. Then I picked up. She was screaming. I mean screaming. The kind of shrieking that sounds less like language and more like a kettle boiling over. She said I'd humiliated her. She said I'd ruined her wedding. She said I had no right. That Nathan would never forgive me. That I was a pathetic, bitter old man who couldn't stand to see his son happy. I waited until she ran out of breath. Then I said, very calmly, Amanda, I'd like you to write down this email address. It belongs to my forensic accountant. Tomorrow morning, you will be receiving a 147-page document detailing every unauthorized charge you have made on my business account since November of last year. I have already forwarded copies to the Calgary Police Service, Economic Crimes Unit, and to my lawyer. You have two options. The first is that you sign a settlement agreement. Return every dollar you have taken and quietly disappear from my son's life. The second is that you are arrested in your wedding dress on Monday morning. The line went very quiet. She said, you wouldn't. I said, good night, Amanda, and I hung up. I slept 4 hours that night, not because I was troubled, but because I was finally at peace. I woke up at 5, made coffee, and drove to my office. By 7 o'clock, I was sitting across from Marjorie Koenig in her downtown office, and by 9 we had filed 3 separate civil actions and an accompanying police report. Monday morning came. Amanda chose the first option. She signed an agreement at 10:15 a.m. in Marjorie's conference room. She returned $92,000 that she had stashed in a separate account at an Edmonton credit union. She signed an annulment consent form that my son's lawyer, arranged hastily that morning by Catherine, of all people, had drafted. She waived any claim to marital property, any claim to Hendricks Precision Engineering, any claim to the house my son had been given as an engagement gift. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue criminal charges. She was out of Nathan's condo by Wednesday. Catherine came to see me on Thursday. She sat in my kitchen, which she hadn't been in for over 2 decades, and she cried for an hour. She told me she was sorry. She told me Gerald's finances were worse than she'd admitted. She told me Nathan had been devastated, had barely spoken since the reception, was staying with a friend in Bridgeland and refusing to see her. I listened. I made her tea. Then I told her something that had taken me 31 years to be able to say. I told her that I had loved her, that I still loved the woman she had been when we were 22, but that the woman sitting in my kitchen was a stranger to me, and that I needed her to leave my house and not come back. She left. Nathan came to see me on Saturday. He looked like he hadn't slept. He stood in my front hallway, and he didn't speak for almost a full minute. Then he said, Dad, I'm so sorry. I hugged my son. I hugged him for a long time. I told him we would rebuild. I told him I had made mistakes too, that I should have spoken up earlier, that I should have protected him from his mother's ambition years ago. I told him he was not responsible for what Amanda did, and he was not responsible for what his mother had done, and that the only thing he was responsible for now was becoming the kind of man who could spot a liar at 50 paces. He moved in with me for 3 weeks while he got his life sorted out. We fished the Bow River together for the first time since he was 12 years old. He asked me questions about the business. He asked me questions about his grandfather, my father, who'd started with a single lathe in a garage in Forest Lawn and built something that fed our family for 70 years. He's now the operations manager at Hendricks Precision. He's good at it. Better than I was at his age. As for me, I met a woman named Margaret at a grief counseling group I'd joined. Because losing a marriage and losing a son and winning them back all in the same decade will take a toll on a man that needs tending. Margaret was there because she'd lost her husband of 39 years to pancreatic cancer. She's a retired pediatric nurse from Lethbridge. She has a laugh like a kitchen window opening in the spring. We've been together 14 months now. She cooks a Sunday roast that would make my grandmother weep with jealousy. She knows every line on my face and loves me anyway. I sometimes think about that moment at the Palliser, when Amanda told me I didn't understand what it meant to be family. She was right. In a way, I didn't understand. I thought family meant loyalty by blood and obligation by name. I thought family meant paying for things so that nobody ever had to ask. I thought family meant smiling through your own humiliation because the alternative was seen. I know better now. Family is the man who hands you a thermos of coffee at 6 in the morning on a fishing trip. Family is the woman who sets a place for you at her table every Sunday. Family is the people who stand beside you when the music stops. Not the ones who dance on your grave while you're still breathing. I hope whoever is listening to this takes something from it. If somebody is taking from you, even someone you love, even someone who shares your name, you have the right to close the door. You have the right to make the phone call. You have the right to walk out of the ballroom and into the summer night and drive home and begin again. You have the right to choose yourself. It took me 63 years to learn that, and I'm still learning. Thank you for listening.